From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today, K-State's Sandy Johnson will talk about a new online resource for you cow-calf producers covering the gamut on cattle AI management. It's called beefrepro.org. At that site, the just updated Estrous Synchronization Planner can be found. Sandy will talk about all of that. Also today from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen. He'll go over the producer liabilities associated with prescribed pasture burning in Kansas. In general, state law gives you producers good protection against liability claims from adjacent landowners, as long as basic practices are followed. And awaiting with another Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven, and more. Next on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we're glad to have you along once more. For openers on this edition, information on a new resource that you cow-calf producers will want to take a look at and make full use of if, in fact, you employ artificial insemination in your breeding program. This is a website, and our guest now calls it an exceptional repository of information on AI and things associated with it. And in fact, she'll be talking some of these things over in her presentation at the upcoming Cattlemen's Day out of K-State this Friday. More on that later. Research and Extension Beef Production Specialist Sandy Johnson of K-State is with us now. So, Sandy, you've been on board with this new resource, helping put it together. What's it all about?
Well, a number of years ago, a group of extension reproductive physiologists kind of decided we would be best served if we kind of worked together on some of our educational efforts. So we were presenting a unified message, and with that effort, we started a series of meetings, and those were from 1 to 3 times per year over the past 20 years. And as we were doing that, we began to capture some of that material, video recordings or the audio, the slides, and all that information. And we also had some information on a University of Nebraska site where one of our team members was located. Over time, we needed to consolidate those websites and as well as just update a website. So we were really pleased this past year as we're trying to go more virtual. We got this one website updated and brought all this material together, and feel like it's a great opportunity for producers to see what's been done in the past, as well as connect with us in a number of ways. And so our current educational efforts then include providing that resource, but also reaching out to producers in a variety of other ways.
Producers should become acquainted with this address, beefrepro.org. That's where the website is located. You're excited about the protocols that it puts out there on various approaches to AI. And in fact, those have been updated, you say, as part of this announcement about the website, Sandy.
Right. We update those annually. And so the 2021 recommendations are out there and available, and we do encourage people to look for the date on top of those. When we first started, we weren't smart enough to put a date on there, but we learned that. So look for a current date as we change those and try and apply our latest research. And then another way we try to help people use that information about recommended protocols is a tool we have called the Estrous Synchronization Planner. And essentially, I look at that as, the recommended protocols represent the recipe, and the Estrous Synchronization Planner helps you carry out that recipe for success. And getting the right thing done on the right day with the right product is important to success. And, I clearly appreciate that we've got a number of products that do the same thing. If you don't use them all the time, they can kind of get jumbled in your mind, and, don't use the right one on the right day. You're not going to get the results you want. So we want to do everything we can to help people have success. And so that tool is specifically designed to do that and ensure you get the right thing done on the right day and the right time. And of course, planning ahead of time is important. We're all busy, and they have other choices if they would have planned further ahead of time. We have some heifer protocols that are 30-some days long, and they work very well for heifers. But if you don't think about what you're going to do till 2 weeks before you want to really start breeding, that limits your choices. So we really encourage people to use that tool. Hopefully it's really easy to use and help you make that plan. And, we got to make sure we got the necessary help there. Every operation's different on what size they are and what they need, but usually there's somebody you need to communicate to about what's going on what day, whether it's getting the semen there on time or the right help there. All those things are important to make that process less stressful on you as well as your animal. So hopefully those tools will help producers apply these systems more successfully.
And again, the Estrous Synchronization Planner is housed at beefrepro.org. Another example of the protocols that the website itself covers, you have information on this in a recent article as well, Sandy, and that is utilizing sexed semen and how you time your AI accordingly, depending on the females in question. You might share a bit about that just to give folks an idea here.
Right. One of the updates that we did include in the Synchronization Planner this year is really addressing more specific use of sex semen and protocols and ways to do that. So that's part of that 2021 update of the Estrous Synchronization Planner that's available. So what we know is the process of sexing semen is, I just look at it as being hard on the cells, okay? In order to be more successful, we found that we need to inseminate cows with sex semen closer to ovulation because they're not viable in the reproductive tract as long. Well, typically, if we're inseminating after observed estrus, we might use an AM/PM rule, see them heat in the morning, breed them in the evening. But when we're using sex semen, the first rule I give people is you're going to get the best results if you only put it in females that have been in heat. Whether you visually observe them or use a heat detection aid, put it in females that are in heat. The results when they are not in heat are just not impressive. So I think it's best to differentiate those groups and put conventional semen in those that are not in heat, sex semen on those that are. And so if you're going to use sex semen, I think probably to get the best results would be using a lot of heat detection and inseminating those anywhere from 16 to 22 hours after the onset of estrus. And how you actually apply that will probably depend on how closely you're, checking heat. If it's 4 times a day or twice a day. From what I hear of the data that some of the companies have, once you get beyond 24 hours after that onset, conception rates drop off pretty quickly. So you don't want to wait too long, but try and wait later than you would with conventional. And then if we still want to use sex semen, but within the context of a fixed-timed AI program, then we just plan to have 2 types of semen there and use a heat detection aid at our time of fixed-timed AI. If they've been in heat, we give them sex semen. If not, they get conventional. And that you won't get as many inseminated to sex semen as perhaps you'd like, but you're probably not going to get that many more pregnancies by inseminating those that have yet to come in heat. So that's one of the better approaches to use. And you can combine that concept then with split-time AI. And essentially that is trying to, instead of fixed-timed AI, we're trying to inseminate everything at one time. And in this case, we're saying, well, if you want to see if you can get a few more in heat by bringing them back the next day, at the regular time of fixed-timed AI, inseminate those that are in heat, again using a heat detection aid. Those that did not come in heat, bring them back the next day, 20 to 24 hours later, do the same thing. If they've been in heat, sex semen, not been in heat, use conventional semen. And anything that's not been in heat, then we would want to make sure to induce ovulation with GnRH. So those are ways that we can do that. And of course, anytime we're bringing them back another day, that takes more labor, and that's not going to fit every situation. And we don't want people to forget they can get very good results with conventional semen and fixed timed AI. Sometimes trying to do a split time AI, particularly with cows or the calf with them, you got to have the right facilities where you decide that that's something we want to do. It may work for some people, much easier to accommodate, I think, with a heifer setting. So anyway, those are the types of options that are out there now. And on Friday, I'll be talking a little bit more about some of the economics and options for applying the sex semen.
But it's quite evident that piecing this all together has to be done carefully to maximize the results. And that's why, again, these resources at this website are so valuable to help producers really map that out appropriately, Sandy.
Right. And one of the things I would mention, Eric, producers always like to hear other producers talk about their programs. And if you go to our website and look at those past applied reproductive strategies conferences, there's usually one or more producers that spoke at each of those. And you can get the audio. Sometimes it's video, depends on what year. You can hear from a lot of other producers. Take advantage of that information.
The source, once more, is beefrepro.org. Check it out, producers, as well. Take in Sandy's presentation on the AI tools and the other approaches for reproductive management that you cow-calf producers might want to consider. That'll be shared at the upcoming Cattlemen's Day at K-State this Friday, March the 5th, virtually. And once more, you can check out the details on that, including registration, at asi.ksu.edu/Cattlemen's Day. Sandy, thank you for sharing this information.
Glad to be here.
Sandy Johnson with us, beef cattle specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back with more for you shortly on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today returns now. Well, it's spring or nearly so, and the opening of what we know around Kansas as the prescribed burning season for our pastures in the state. That'll really get rolling in the coming weeks. As we visit once again with Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation, Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen, want to get into the legal issues involved with prescribed burning in Kansas and the protections provided to agricultural producers who employ this practice. And yes, it is a necessity in many areas of the state for preserving our grasslands, Roger.
Well, it sure is. It's a critical component of rangeland management, and it's viewed as an effective and affordable way to reverse and control negative impacts of woody plant growth and the expansion of that growth that damages native grasslands. And it also has a double benefit, and it plays a role in limiting wildfire risk. And so there are those benefits to it, Eric.
However, over the many years, producers have brought up questions about their individual liabilities if a prescribed burn gets out of hand, goes where it shouldn't. And the state of Kansas, through its regulatory function, has addressed this and lined out some guidelines, has it not?
That's right. The rules that govern this in Kansas are largely in the administrative code. They are regulations that have been developed by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. There's not too much statutory guidance, and we have some case law guidance. But basically, when you want to do a prescribed burn or a controlled burn, whatever you want to call it, you have to follow the regulations that are in the administrative code of Kansas.
And those regulations are fairly straightforward, are they not, in as far as what individuals must adhere to when they're igniting and then managing a prescribed burn?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is common sense, but we do need to know what the rules are so that we don't trip ourselves up and get in trouble. But when we're talking open burning of agricultural land, the general rule in Kansas is that open burning is prohibited, and so you have to fall within an exception. And one of those exceptions is for open burning of ag lands that is done in accordance with the regulations. So that's the key. Yes, you can burn farmland, ranch land, but you have to follow the regulations. And so when you look at those regulations, open burning of vegetation such as grass and woody species, crop residue, other dry plant growth for the purpose of, as the regs say, crop, range, pasture, wildlife, or watershed management is exempt from the general prohibition on open burning. So that's where we want to start with the analysis here. So if we're burning vegetation, and that's defined as grass, woody species, crop residue, other dry plant growth, for the purpose of crop, range, pasture, wildlife, or watershed management, then we're okay. So we start with that basic framework, and then we build from there.
And building from there as far as requirements on the individual to do such things as notify local authorities, assure that the smoke emitted from that fire isn't crossing roadways, fairly basic principles here.
Yeah, and a lot of this is left up to the counties and the municipalities, too, if you're close to those. So there can be differences from county to county. So, for example, a burn, if you start a burn, the general rule is you notify local fire control authority with jurisdiction in the area unless local government has said, no, they don't need notice. And that might be the case in certain areas of Kansas. The burn, as you said, can't create a traffic hazard. Now, that's a sometimes thing because when we're out burning, the wind can change. We can start and we've got the wind in the right direction. It's not going to go over a roadway. It's not going to create a traffic hazard. And then it can shift on you. And so the wind might result in smoke blowing toward a public roadway. Then in that instance, you do need to give notice to the highway patrol, the county sheriff, or local traffic officials before the burn has started. If you've got the wind that might carry it over the roadway, if it shifts, it's a good idea to notify them then.
One of the things that ties into the concerns about a fire escaping is that the regulations clearly state, Roger, that the burn must be supervised until that fire is extinguished. Yeah,
you've got to stay there and monitor it until it's out. You need to make sure it's out. I could cite you some cases in the past. It was a Kansas case. It wasn't actually a prescribed burning case, but it was a case that it was started. You can have these fires that will start in a pasture by a carelessly discarded cigarette, for example, or you could have a catalytic converter on a pickup truck that gets hot and it ignites a fire. Well, and if you stay around and you think you've got it out and then you leave and then the wind picks up and you miss something and it starts again, as a Kansas court said, you're not going to be strictly liable for that. And if you didn't display any negligence in putting that fire out and you had a good reasonable belief that it was out, you can leave the premises at that point in time if you've done everything you think you can to get it extinguished and you've done your best and the evidence shows that. Now, the problem is going to be, of course, demonstrating that to the satisfaction of a court or a jury, if it's a jury trial, that, yes, you did these things. We typically don't have pictures while we're doing these things or as they occur or video, but that's possible. But, the general rule is if problems occur, then it's ordinary negligence is the standard. But, yes, stay around until the fire is out. Don't start a fire unless it can be extinguished before dark. That's a good general rule, although we can have nighttime burns, too, as long as they're monitored and watched. And I'm sure we've all seen burns in the Flint Hills at nighttime. Just be careful. Make sure you have sufficient water trucks. So you've lit your backfire. You've followed the regulations with respect to how to conduct it. And then have appropriate hands-on and people around to make sure that it can be managed sufficiently. But
let's dive into the legalities here of negligence if a fire does get away out of bounds, if you will. And you say there are 3 tests that have to be met for an escaped fire to be a negligent episode.
Yeah, the negligence principle is, I call it the great bulwark of civil liabilities law. Most of our cases are decided based on negligence principles. Those principles say that I have a duty to act in a certain way with respect to whatever I'm doing, and if I breach that duty and the breach of that duty causes damages, then if all four links of that chain are present, then I can be liable for those damages. But each condition, each one of those links in the chain has to be there before I can be held to be negligent. And so when we apply those principles in a burning situation, well, what is my duty? Well, my duty is to not cause harm to an adjacent landowner, whether that's smoke drift, whether that's burning their property that wasn't supposed to be burned. I have a duty not to do that. Now, whether I breach that duty is dependent on facts and circumstances. Was I overtly negligent in allowing my fire to escape or allowing to have heavy smoke that I knew was going to drift onto their property? Was there some intent involved? Well, that can definitely be a factor here. You could have an intentional interference with somebody else's property, which is not really under the negligence heading, but it's close. And so all of these cases are fact-dependent. There is no black and white test that we can throw out there to say, you're responsible for the damages caused by your prescribed burn in that situation, or no, you're not. It just depends on the facts.
And just as an important footnote along with this, in any such case, any such claim, the plaintiff has to prove that negligence. The burden of proof is on that individual.
That's correct, yes. And the plaintiff bears that burden of proof to all of those four elements by what's known as a preponderance of the evidence, just over 50% standard. It has to be more likely than not that you violated each one of those links in that chain, so to speak, of negligence. That's a pretty tough standard. So basically, if you're following all the regs, and that's going to be a key point to this, if you can show that you were in compliance with all of the Kansas regulations that govern prescribed burning, that's pretty good evidence that any damage that resulted was not the result of your negligence. So that's why we pay attention to those regulations. We want to know what those rules are. We want to follow them because that will largely protect us if our fire escapes and damages someone else.
Just want to ask, though, Roger, we're speaking of negligence, the things that apply here in Kansas. Are there any circumstances, or have there been, where the more serious, strict liability would kick in regarding prescribed burning?
Not so much in Kansas. That's not the Kansas rule that is applied in the state of Kansas. Farmers and ranchers, the courts have said, have a right to set controlled fires on their property for ag purposes, and they won't be liable for damages that result if the fire is set and managed with ordinary care and prudence, depending on the conditions present. And that language that I just gave you came from a Kansas Court of Appeals decision back in 1996. And that's still the rule. At least at the present time, the courts have determined in Kansas that there is no compelling argument for imposing strict liability on a property owner for damages that result from a prescribed burn on agricultural land. You're not responsible unless you were negligent, which then throws it back on compliance with the regulations that the state has set forth.
All in all, good protections for agricultural producers who utilize prescribed burning as long as they adhere, as you say, to those local as well as state regulations applying to this. And Roger, as usual, has a blog article on this topic. If you'd like to review it in detail, it's at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, simply entitled Prescribed Burning Legal Issues. Roger, always a pleasure. Thanks for being along with us.
Thank you, Eric.
Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation, Washburn University School of Law. Roger's along with us every other Wednesday on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Two U.S. senators are attempting to address transparency in the cattle market, reintroducing a piece of legislation yesterday that was originally offered last year. The Cattle Market Transparency Act of 2021 would establish regional cash minimums and would equip producers with more market information. Senators Deb Fischer of Nebraska and Ron Wyden of Oregon introduced the legislation that has been years in the making. Representative Vicky Hartzler of Missouri is expected to introduce companion legislation in the U.S. House. The Senate bill would establish regional mandatory minimum thresholds of negotiated cash and negotiated grid trades to enable price discovery in cattle marketing regions. It would require the USDA Secretary, in consultation with the Chief Economist, USDA, to establish regionally sufficient levels of negotiated cash and negotiated grid trade and then seek public comment on those levels. Also under this bill, the USDA would be required to create and maintain a publicly available library of marketing contracts between packers and producers while ensuring confidentiality for producers. The bill would also require packers to report to the USDA the number of cattle scheduled to be delivered for slaughter each day for the next 14 days and require the USDA to report that information daily. And the legislation would also prohibit the USDA from using confidentiality as a justification for not reporting all information. Last fall, 17 state affiliates of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and other livestock groups supported nearly identical legislation introduced by Fischer and Hartzler. The legislation also has received backing from the American Farm Bureau Federation and the U.S. Cattlemen's Association. Meatpacking workers across the country have started receiving coronavirus vaccines. Thousands more will have a chance to get their shots this week. The United Food and Commercial Workers Union's Vice President of Food Processing and Meatpacking, Mark Lauritsen, said that interest in the vaccine is high among workers after the industry took such a heavy toll from the virus. He expects that roughly 70% of workers who get the chance to be vaccinated will get a shot. Last spring, major outbreaks at a number of meatpacking plants forced them to close temporarily because of the numbers of illnesses and to install additional safety measures. Across the industry, production fell as low as 60% of capacity in April at the height of the plant closures before rebounding to near normal levels over the summer. The major meatpacking companies, JBS, Cargill, Tyson, and Smithfield, say a number of states plan to begin vaccinating meat plant workers this week, including Kansas, Iowa, Colorado, and Nebraska. In some states, only workers aged 65 or older are able to receive the vaccine at this point. Several of those states are conducting mass vaccination events at plants. Company officials and the union have been encouraging workers to get those shots. Now, even after the vaccinations, meat companies will have to continue to rely on the safety measures they took since last spring. After those outbreaks began, meat producers tried to protect workers by instituting temperature checks, installing plastic dividers between workstations, increasing plant sanitation, and requiring masks and other protective gear. In some cases, companies upgraded their plant ventilation systems as well. And House Democratic leaders stripped a provision from the latest pandemic aid package that would have helped farmers suffering from crop losses, including losses due to high winds or derechos. This before the House held its early Saturday vote on the coronavirus aid relief. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa called out House leaders yesterday for stripping the provision from the $1.9 trillion aid package. Grassley told reporters he will push fellow senators to reinstate the agricultural disaster language in that bill. The provision for wind and derecho losses was introduced initially in the House Agriculture Committee back in February when the committee got together to mark up the agricultural share of the House aid package. The amendment came from Representative Randy Feenstra of Iowa. The provision did not add extra costs to the bill, but would have shifted some of the $4 billion allocated in the bill for agriculture meant for the food supply chain and agricultural pandemic response. Feenstra's amendment ended up passing 24-23 in the Ag Committee's only vote after fellow Iowa Republican Cindy Axne, a Democrat, changed her vote to side with every Republican on that committee. Every other Democrat on the committee voted against the crop losses amendment. Now, effectively, Feenstra's provision gave Iowa farmers and potentially grain elevators a pathway to apply for the USDA's WHIP Plus program. The USDA estimated 850,000 crop acres were lost in the storm in Iowa, and other farmers saw significant yield declines affecting as many as 60 counties. Roughly 100 million bushels of on-farm and commercial grain storage were destroyed as well across the state. Now, while the language was in the House Budget Committee, Representative John Yarmouth of Kentucky, the chairman of the House Budget Committee, introduced a detailed and lengthy manager's amendment, as they call it. That amendment removed all of that language about payments for crop losses. While heavily affecting Iowa, the damage from the derecho to crops stretched from eastern Nebraska to Illinois and across Indiana as well. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration put the entire destruction at roughly $11 billion. Drier weather patterns are certainly lending the risk of wildfires in Kansas, and Scarlett Higgins says officials indicate various segments of the state could be impacted.
According to a recent report from officials with the Kansas Maisonette, a network of 70 weather stations throughout the state, a swing to drier weather patterns and higher winds this spring likely is to increase the risk of wildfires in parts of the state. Kansas Maisonette manager Chip Redmond said these expected weather conditions, combined with an above-normal amount of fuel load or grass, have increased the potential of fire from south central to northwest Kansas. He explained the weather pattern is anticipated to transition toward La Niña and become conducive to dry frontal passages early this month. With this in mind, along with the recent drought in the western part of the state, Redmond said the impacted areas likely will expand because precipitation trends statewide are below normal through most of the spring, a time of more critical importance for annual moisture totals. An increase of dry fronts typically results in an increase of Kansas wind events. Many of the state's historically large fires have occurred due to strong frontal systems like those expected this spring, according to Redmond. He said precipitation timing will be crucial to reversing the current fire danger. If consecutive storm systems can impact the region with widespread moisture in mid to late March, Redmond said it could drastically enhance greenup and aid in diminishing fire concerns. I'm Scarlett Higgins.
And this is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
To say it is what it is does not solve the problem.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
It is what it is. That's what a dear friend of mine used to say. I'm saying it when the old shoulder hurts and my wife sees me winch. It is what it is. I was thinking the same, it is what it is, when I read the latest issue of the Kansas Farmer and more articles about Kansas water issues. There is the article by P.J. Grigspor, Water Issues Rise as Drought Deepens. Then I see the advertisements run circles around Mother Nature, talking about the smart pivot, and more articles about irrigation. But there must be water. Earlier I pulled the book, Home on the Range, A Century on the High Plains, by James Dickinson off the shelf, and started to read chapter 15 again. It has yellow highlight markings from an earlier reading. The chapter is titled Grass to Grass, the Buffalo Commons. I'm not going there, but I've saved several notes. The chapter quotes the book by Dan O'Brien titled In the Center of the Nation. O'Brien writes, when you get the feeling that the whole world can see you, but no one is watching, you have come to the grasslands of North America. I like that. Gosh, there's so much to read and think, but that's how we learn, living, reading, thinking. And by the way, talking about books, a friend who grew up near Ulysses wrote a book about that region. It will be on the shelves this spring. Written by a local, it should be good. I'll let you know when it is out. Yes, it reflects on water. Which makes me think, do our elementary and high school students get taught details about our state to the extent that they know, really know? I can understand that people in the eastern part of our state look differently at western Kansas, but I hope they look. We're all Kansans. I think the facts should be laid down in the first 12 years so that they know their own state well. They can grasp the significance from knowing the other neighboring states and the rest of the country, the world. I hope it is being taught. In December 2019, the Manhattan Mercury had an article about Turtle Creek Lake. The article shows aerial photos and states that Turtle Creek Lake Reservoir has lost nearly half of its original storage capacity since it became fully operational in 1962 due to sedimentation. To say it is what it is does not solve the problem, as future water shortages can be predicted if there are droughts. And we do know droughts. It is what it is. When I fill the kettle, the tea kettle in the morning, with clean water, I say, thank you. I'm saying it to no one in particular, but I'm fully aware of the water being there. And when I let the tap run for a moment, I feel a pang of guilt. Water is a precious commodity. Rainwater that falls on our farm collects on the cow path and runs down the hills to the ponds or directly through the draws into McIntyre Creek. When the ponds are full, the overflow does the same. McIntyre Creek runs into Turtle Creek, and our land adds to the sedimentation problem. I know I've cut down on sending sediment off the fields down the creek because I've put all land in grass. What I cannot do much about is the erosion of the stream banks. That is a natural process, but made unnatural where streams are narrow and trees have been allowed to grow up alongside the stream banks or trees have been planted. Along the narrow streams, trees on the bank are undercut, and when the cutting gets to be severe, the trees topple, and as they topple, their root mass tips tons of good soil into the stream. I've studied it and seen it at our farm, and it is a problem. It's a problem for me and for Turtle Creek Lake. Planting trees along narrow, steep-graded streams is a mistake. Of course, the steep sides of the creek allows one to grow crops close to the creek and maximizes acreage. I've seen where bulldozers slope the creek side and then trees and shrubs are planted. Only shrubs will be better. It is an expensive operation. I cannot see the economics of it, except we save soil. And it is for that reason I placed all my bottomland into hay or grazing. It's not the most economical choice. The fields are too small to make the necessary buffers. And I remember talking with some older farmers who grew up here saying, if they just would let us put in the farm ponds we wanted, we could control the flooding downriver. When I fly over and see all the little hills and valleys and see the watersheds, I wonder. I'm not an engineer, but I know farmers have a lot of common sense, and they know their land. I won't be around when Tuttle Creek Dam is filled with soil, and we can grow crops again in the wide, long valley on top of all the good old land underneath, with its history of human settlement. I know I own land at the base of the Mississippi River. There lay sediment of our farm, our land, collected over the years, coming down the hills, the creeks, the river, the bigger river, the very big river, the very, very big river. It is what it is.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That's our time once again. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.